A stormy beginning. A cloudy morning whispered the promise of rain as the sky grew heavy and ominous. Without warning, the heavens opened, releasing a torrential downpour. Thunder roared across the horizon, and jagged lightning cut through the gloom. But like all summer storms, it was fleeting. Soon, gusts of wind swept the dark clouds away, revealing a brilliant sunrise. The golden rays broke through the remnants of rain, painting the world anew. Mark Nicholson stirred awake, his gaze falling on his wife Jessica, still lost in slumber. She looked serene, her lips curling slightly as if savoring a sweet dream. He admired her, marveling at her beauty. How lucky I am to have you, he thought. It hadn't always been this way. 5 years ago, Mark had endured the loss of his first wife to a severe asthma attack. Her death had left a void in his soul, one that time could not easily fill. She had harbored a secret, a truth that came to light only in her final days. Unable to have children, she had concealed the reason, a complicated medical history stemming from a youthful mistake. Before meeting Mark, she had undergone a clandestine abortion, an act that rendered her infertile. Her guilt over her inability to conceive had consumed her, and she confessed this burden on her deathbed, seeking forgiveness she believed would never come. From Mark or from God. Mark had mourned her deeply, though her deception gnawed at him. He told himself he could have forgiven her youthful misstep, but the years of secrecy hurt him more than the truth itself. Her passing left him questioning whether he had ever truly loved her, or merely clung to the idea of what they could have been. Time moved forward relentlessly, but Mark found no solace in fleeting romances. He was 44 now, without children, and lonelier than ever. A new chapter. 2 years ago, during a business trip, Mark met Jessica on a train. She was captivating, 8 years his junior, full of life, laughter, and charm. She possessed a warmth that melted his guarded heart. Despite living in different cities, they began a whirlwind romance, meeting frequently and growing closer with each encounter. When Mark proposed, Jessica surprised him with her honesty. I need to tell you something before I say yes. I've been married before. As a child, I had a terrible accident. I fell through the ice while skating. The near drowning and illness that followed left me unable to have children. My first husband and I divorced for other reasons. But I know this is something you deserve to know. Her candor unsettled Mark at first, but his feelings for her outweighed his doubts. 2 weeks later, he proposed again, this time with full acceptance. Maybe children aren't in the cards for me, and that's okay. I love you for who you are, not for what we can or can't have together. Just tell me one thing. How do you truly feel about me? Jessica's eyes softened as she replied, I love you too. I've never known love like this before. The decision is yours, Mark. But I'm ready if you are. They married soon after. 2 years passed, and Mark was convinced Jessica was his destiny. She brought light back into his life, and he adored her completely. A fateful evening. That morning, Jessica woke to find Mark already awake, watching her with a tender smile. You're up early, she murmured, stretching before leaning in to kiss him. I couldn't resist admiring the most beautiful woman in the world, he replied. Later that evening, Mark prepared to leave for a business trip to New York. As chief engineer at an aircraft manufacturing plant, his expertise was unparalleled, earning him respect among his peers. Jessica, a psychologist, spent the day ensuring he had everything he needed, cooking his favorite meals, packing his bags, and showering him with affection. As Mark was about to leave, the doorbell rang. Standing on the other side was Peter Owens, a close friend, and the head of the plant's technical department. Surprised to see me? Peter asked, his usual lively demeanor tinged with unease. Is something wrong? Mark inquired. Not exactly. I just need to discuss a few details about the trip on our way to the airport. I told your driver he could leave. Hope you don't mind taking my Jeep. Though puzzled, Mark agreed. Once they were on the road, Peter's demeanor grew serious. Mark, listen carefully. I need you to trust me. I want you to give up your ticket for tonight's flight. Call in sick, and let me take your place at the meeting. Afterward, head home unannounced. There's something you need to see. Mark frowned, confusion giving way to irritation. What are you talking about, Peter? Stop being cryptic. Peter took a deep breath. I didn't want to tell you this, but I have no choice. Jessica's been unfaithful to you. For months, people have been talking rumors, whispers at the plant. She's been seen with other men, including a pilot. I even have a recording of a phone call between her and one of them. I didn't want to believe it, but the evidence is undeniable. You deserve the truth. If I'm wrong, I'll accept whatever punishment you think I deserve. But you need to see for yourself. Go home tonight, quietly after midnight. Mark felt as though the ground had been ripped from beneath him. This is absurd, he muttered. Jessica loves me. She's never given me a reason to doubt her. Peter pressed on. I know it's hard to hear, but as your friend, I can't let you ignore this. Please, Mark, just verify it. If I'm wrong, I'll leave you in peace. At the airport, Mark faced a bitter dilemma. Board the flight and fulfill his professional obligations, or turn back and confront the possibility of betrayal. Standing at the gate, ticket in hand, he turned to Peter. You've humiliated me tonight, Pete. But if you're lying, you'll regret this. Peter nodded, his expression somber. I'd rather lose your friendship than watch you live a lie. As the boarding call echoed through the terminal, Mark's heart wavered. The storm outside had passed, but inside him, a tempest was only beginning to brew. The breaking point. Mark sat motionless in the airport lounge, the weight of Peter's words pressing down on him like a leaden cloud. His chest tightened, and he swallowed a pill to ease the ache in his heart. The final boarding announcement for his flight to New York echoed over the loudspeakers, but Mark remained rooted to his chair, head in his hands, wrestling with a storm of thoughts. What now? He muttered to himself. If I go to New York, these doubts will devour me. But what if Peter's wrong? What if I go home and destroy the trust I've built with Jessica over a baseless suspicion? Taking a deep breath, Mark called his wife. He forced calm into his voice. Hey honey, I'm boarding now. I'll call you later. Jessica's cheerful response only deepened the knot in his stomach. Her happiness seemed genuine. But was it? He stayed in the lounge for another 2 hours, his boarding pass crumpled in his hand, before finally making his decision. A quiet homecoming. Outside, a light drizzle fell, the damp pavement shimmering under the glow of streetlights. The cool air kissed Mark's flushed face as he hailed a taxi and gave the address of his apartment. Arriving at the old 1930s building, its tall ceilings and ornate plasterwork usually felt comforting. But tonight, the familiar setting felt cold and unwelcoming. Mark climbed the stairs to the 5th floor. Each step weighted with dread. Reaching his apartment door, he froze. For 30 long minutes, he stood on the landing, his heart hammering and his veins throbbing. Finally, he slipped the key into the lock and opened the door quietly. The foyer greeted him with an immediate and unsettling sight. A pair of unfamiliar men's shoes sat neatly by the entrance. Mark inhaled deeply, steadying himself. Stay calm, he commanded inwardly. Control is your weapon now. Rage will only weaken you. He moved further inside, his steps silent on the plush carpet. The living room was in disarray. The dining table, set for two, bore the remnants of a private dinner. Half-eaten food, an open bottle of cognac, an empty champagne bottle, and 2 ornate glasses. A pilot's uniform shirt and jacket were draped over one chair, and Jessica's silk robe lay carelessly on another. A bouquet of red roses stood proudly in a vase on the coffee table, alongside a decorative box of chocolates. Mark's chest tightened as he took in the scene. These weren't here when I left, he thought bitterly. Summoning a steely resolve, he tidied up the mess with meticulous care. He washed the dishes, ironed the pilot's uniform, polished his shoes, and neatly hung Jessica's robe beside them. Each action was a quiet rebellion against the chaos unfolding in his heart. The unforgivable truth. The closed bedroom door loomed before him. Mark's hand hovered over the knob before he pushed it open a crack. There, under the dim light of the bedside lamp, Jessica and her lover lay entwined in each other's arms, their contented faces etched with a betrayal too blatant to ignore. Mark's vision blurred momentarily, but he forced himself to close the door softly. He retreated to the kitchen, sank onto a chair, and stared into the void. Minutes stretched into hours, the ticking of the wall clock punctuating the silence. At 3 a.m., as the darkness outside began to lift, Mark made a decision. He opened the fridge, retrieved ingredients, and began to cook. By dawn, the dining table was set for breakfast, the aroma of fresh coffee and warmed croissants wafting through the air. A chilling morning. Tray in hand, Mark walked to the bedroom and opened the door. His voice, louder than usual, cut through the stillness. Time to get up. Your clothes are in the living room, cleaned and pressed. I'll be waiting in the dining room for breakfast. Jessica and her lover jolted awake, their eyes widening in disbelief as they registered Mark standing before them. They said nothing, their minds struggling to process what was happening. Don't keep me waiting, Mark said, his tone unnervingly composed. He returned to the dining room, where he sat with the patience of a man whose heart had already shattered. A half-hour later, the pilot appeared first, followed closely by Jessica. Their faces were pale, their steps hesitant, as they took seats at the table. Please sit, Mark said, gesturing to the food. I made coffee, just the way you like it, honey. Enjoy. The pilot remained silent, knowing any words would only deepen the humiliation. He began to eat hesitantly, while Jessica sat frozen, her hands trembling. What's wrong, sweetheart? Mark asked, his voice cutting through her terror. Not in the mood for coffee? Drink it, it'll calm your nerves. Her hand shook as she lifted the cup, her teeth tapping against the rim. Mark's expression remained impassive, his face as unreadable as stone. When the pilot finished, he stood and asked softly, Sir, may I leave now? Mark's lips curved into a faint, sardonic smile. Of course. You're free to go. The pilot walked to the front door, only to find it locked. Sheepishly, he turned back, unwilling to re-enter the dining room. The only other way out was the balcony, a fatal exit. The pilot stepped onto the fifth-floor balcony and looked down. A spiked iron fence lined the perimeter below, a chilling reminder of the height he'd have to navigate. Desperation pushed him forward. He attempted to climb down to the fourth floor, but lost his footing when a piece of plaster gave way. In a flash, he fell, his body landing brutally on the iron spikes. His groan of agony echoed briefly before silence reclaimed the dawn. The consequences of betrayal. Jessica, sensing the disaster, rushed to the window. She saw the pilot's lifeless body impaled on the fence below. Her hand flew to her mouth, stifling a scream. Mark remained seated at the table, sipping his coffee. His calmness was more terrifying than any outburst could have been. Eat your breakfast, Jessica, he said quietly. The coffee's still warm. A primal guttural scream escaped her lips, muffled by the thick walls that surrounded her. Desperation flooded through her veins as she ran from room to room, her panic mounting with every step. She was searching for a phone, any way to escape, but found none. The home line had been disconnected, and Mark had confiscated their cell phones, her lifeline severed. She felt as though she were an animal caught in a trap, helpless, her hands pressing against her temples, in a futile attempt to calm the storm inside her mind. God, what have I done? She thought, the weight of her actions sinking in. He'll never forgive me. How could I bring a lover into our home? The insanity of it all was overwhelming, and she could see it in Mark's eyes, the cold, unspoken judgment. It was as if he wanted her to pay for her sin. In a frantic rush, Jessica confronted Mark, but he barely seemed to register her presence. He sat hunched at the kitchen table, his head bowed, lost in a fog of hopelessness. It was as if he had disappeared into himself, his mind shattered by the depth of his betrayal. Jessica, desperate and afraid, turned away and stumbled into the bathroom. Her fingers trembled as she opened the lower cabinet, searching for something, anything that could bring her some kind of release from the suffocating tension that gripped her chest. Her hand brushed against a bottle, vinegar, concentrated and potent. In a daze, she unscrewed the cap and poured a large portion into her mouth, the acrid liquid burning her throat. She collapsed to the floor, her body convulsing as a savage, searing pain coursed through her. Her breath came in ragged gasps as she screamed in agony, but the thick walls of the house swallowed every sound, leaving her trapped in her own suffering. She clawed at her face, her eyes wide with mortal fear, but it was too late. Minutes stretched into eternity, her body racked with torment, until she could no longer scream. The only sound left was a ghastly rasp, a feeble breath that barely escaped her throat. Alone in that silent bathroom, her body stiffened in its final spasm. And then, with a last shuddering breath, the pain stopped. Death had come to claim her, offering her the release she so desperately sought. Mark eventually entered the bathroom. He stood in the doorway, his eyes vacant as he gazed at Jessica's lifeless body, a once vibrant woman now reduced to a distorted, hollow mask of what she had been. His face showed no emotion, only the weight of the tragedy that had unfolded under his roof. Stiffly, he left the room and called 911. His voice was barely a whisper as he muttered into the phone, "My wife is dead, and there's a man's body outside." He gave his name and address, his words trailing off in a daze. Mark unlocked the front door and slumped onto a small hallway bench, his head pounding as though an iron band were crushing his skull. He leaned back against the wall and waited for the authorities, his mind still reeling. The case was brought to trial, and Judge Elizabeth Carter, a woman who had spent 2 decades on the bench, found herself faced with an unprecedented and strange situation. She struggled to categorize the deaths, one an accident, the other a suicide. Some might argue that Mark had morally pushed them both to their ends, but that was not a legal standard. Statements from the police and prosecutor revealed that Mark had openly confessed his overwhelming grief upon discovering Jessica's affair. Yet, despite his emotional turmoil, he had not resorted to direct violence. His calmness, even when cleaning the pilot's uniform and preparing breakfast, was not a sign of indifference, but rather his way of making them realize the gravity of their actions. Mark had taken away their means of communication, temporarily, as a way to make them feel a fraction of his own pain. But he never anticipated the tragic consequences that would follow. He expressed regret that he hadn't taken Jessica to the hospital, but at the time, his thoughts were beyond rational control. He might have thrown Jessica out of the house or allowed the pilot to leave, but by the time he realized what had happened, it was already too late. Mark's defense attorney presented a damning picture of Jessica's past, a history of promiscuity, addiction, and betrayal. She had once been a prostitute, selling herself for money, and her first marriage had ended when her ex-husband discovered her infidelity and became an alcoholic. After he was kicked out, he died in a brawl. Jessica had even fabricated stories about her childhood and infertility. Mark, devastated by these revelations, realized he had been blind to the truth of her past. He had genuinely fallen in love with her, unable to see beyond her facade, and now he was left to pick up the pieces. The witnesses testified on Mark's behalf, painting him as a respected and honorable man, a devoted family member, and an outstanding leader in his field. They spoke of Jessica's constant infidelity and flawed character. Even the pilot's widow, who, though devastated by her husband's death, acknowledged that she had long suspected his unfaithfulness. She believed the deaths were a tragic accident, perhaps a divine punishment. When the judge gave Mark the final word in court, his once dark hair now streaked with gray, he expressed sincere remorse for the tragedy. He never intended to harm anyone. He offered condolences to the pilot's widow and promised to support her children financially. The courtroom waited in silence as the judge retired to deliberate. The verdict was delivered, not guilty. There was no evidence of a crime. The courtroom erupted in applause, honoring the fairness of the judge's ruling. Mark was free, but the weight of his past would never be far behind. In life, we often see individuals so blinded by love that they fail to recognize betrayal. Mark's story is a reminder that no one is immune to mistakes. The same can be said for women too. Not long after the trial, Mark made a drastic decision. He sold his home, his car, and every possession he had. He resigned from his esteemed position as chief engineer. His colleagues and friends tried to persuade him to stay, but Mark's decision was final. "I'm sorry, friends, but I must leave," he said. "I can't stay here." Peter, his lifelong friend, was devastated. He couldn't imagine life without Mark. But Mark confided in him about a letter he had received from Jack, a friend from their days at the Air Force Academy. Jack, who had lost his wife and son in a tragic accident years ago, had retreated to the Alaskan wilderness to heal. Mark, in his grief, sought solace in Jack's words. "I need to leave," Mark told Peter. "Maybe Alaska will bring me the peace I've been searching for." Mark gave all the money he received from selling his belongings to the pilot's widow, Irene, before boarding a flight bound for Alaska. It was a place that, though distant, now felt closer to him than anywhere else. A place where he hoped to heal, to find forgiveness, and perhaps a chance at redemption.